Hi everyone. Imagine this, you're a B-25 pilot. The deck of the Hornet is pitching violently on the ocean swells. Your runway is ridiculously short. You have just enough fuel to reach Tokyo, and then ditch somewhere in China. The only aircraft carrier brave enough to bring you this close to the enemy's shores was the Hornet. It was she who launched the Doolittle Raiders, America's first strike back at Japan after Pearl Harbor. But that was only the beginning of her legend. She fought like a demon at Midway, then threw herself into her final, savage battle in the Solomon Islands. And then, she vanished from the pages of history long before she earned the fame she deserved. Why did that happen? Let's find out. Why did America, in just a few months, decide to launch what seemed like a completely insane bombing raid on Tokyo? The motive was actually very simple. But that doesn't make it any less painful. On December 7, 1941, Japan destroyed the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Without warning. Without a declaration of war. This wasn't just a surprise attack. It was an operation executed almost to perfection. To remain undetected, the Japanese task force of 6 aircraft carriers didn't take the usual southern route. Instead, they sailed far to the north, through stormy seas and thick fog, where almost no merchant ships ever went. Complete radio silence. All communication was done only with signal flags and flashing lights. Now here's a detail you rarely hear in the standard retellings. The world believed Pearl Harbor was safe from aerial torpedoes. The harbor was only about 40 feet deep. A normal torpedo dropped from a plane would dive deep and slam straight into the bottom. But Japanese engineers came up with a clever solution: wooden stabilizers on their Type 91 torpedoes. These allowed the torpedoes to skim just below the surface instead of diving deep. Skill was only half the story. The other half was incredible luck. That morning, the American destroyer USS Ward spotted and sank a Japanese midget submarine right at the entrance to the harbor, a full hour before the air attack began. They reported it. The response? We're investigating. Radar on Oahu detected the incoming Japanese planes nearly an hour before the attack. A young officer reported it. He was told, "Don't worry, those are probably our B-17s flying in from California." Japanese diplomats in Washington were supposed to deliver a declaration of war 30 minutes before the attack. Due to delays, it was handed over only after Pearl Harbor was already burning. And perhaps most importantly, not a single American aircraft carrier was in the harbor that day. The Enterprise was returning from a mission at sea, the Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway, and the Saratoga was back in San Diego. Japan had just shown the world that the era of the battleship was over. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun. America's fleet was in flames. The nation was in shock. And it was that very shock that created one burning question: how do we hit back so hard that Japan understands, America will not be humiliated without consequences? The answer they came up with was as bold as it was insane: launch Army B-25 bombers from an aircraft carrier, fly all the way to Tokyo, drop the bombs, and figure out how to land wherever they could. And the carrier chosen for this impossible mission was the Hornet. Why was the Hornet chosen for this insane mission? The Hornet was the newest aircraft carrier in the US Navy. She had been commissioned just 6 months earlier, in October 1941. Her own air group wasn't even fully formed yet, which actually worked in their favor. Her deck was almost completely clear. She also had one of the longest flight decks of any American carrier, nearly 250 meters. That was critical for launching heavy Army B-25 bombers. The other big carriers were either under repair or already assigned to combat operations. So the Hornet became the only ship available for this extremely risky mission. Her captain, Mark Mitchell, received a simple order: prepare for a special mission. You will receive details only after we sail. And that's how the newest carrier in the fleet became the star of one of the boldest operations of the war. The Doolittle Raid was considered a suicide mission from the very beginning, and not without reason. It was April 1942. Just 4.5 months after Pearl Harbor. American forces were retreating across the Pacific. Japan had captured Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and was now threatening Australia. In the United States, people were gripped by despair and fear. It was at this darkest moment that President Roosevelt demanded a direct strike on Japan itself. The problem was distance. America had no bombers capable of flying from Hawaii to Tokyo and back. Then a crazy idea was born. Its author was a submarine captain named Francis Lowe. While looking at an aircraft carrier, he simply asked, "What if?" The plan was audacious: take Army medium bombers, big, heavy B-25 Mitchells designed for long concrete runways, launch them from a carrier deck, bomb Tokyo, and then continue on to China. There would be no returning to the ship. Command of the operation was given to a living legend of aviation, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. By then, Doolittle had already made history. He was the first pilot to perform a blind flight, taking off, flying, and landing using only instruments. He had won nearly every major air race in America and held a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT. 16 B-25B Mitchell bombers, 80 volunteers, 1 aircraft carrier, the Hornet. And one simple order: take off, bomb the target, and make it out however you can. This was the beginning of one of the most daring operations of World War II. Now, here are some facts about the Doolittle Raid that still surprise even people who know the story. Many think Jimmy Doolittle was just a brave pilot. In reality, he was a brilliant military scientist. They called him the Little Professor because of his small stature, just 5'6", and his incredible intellect. He understood the physics of flight better than almost anyone in the US Army. Normally, bombers used the complex and expensive Norden bomb sight, which only worked well from high altitude. At low level, it was useless. So Captain Ross Greening came up with an incredibly simple solution: a bomb sight that cost just 20 cents. 2 pieces of metal welded together. It was connected to the pilot's cockpit so the bombardier could literally guide the pilot where to turn, without saying a word. These sights were quickly built at Eglin Field, and they worked perfectly. A lot of people think the main problem was that the planes couldn't land back on the carrier. That's true, but there was a bigger reason. As soon as all the B-25s were airborne, the task force had to turn around immediately and steam away at full speed. If the Hornet had stayed in the area waiting for the bombers to return, Japanese aircraft would have found and sunk her, sacrificing 16 planes and 80 men to save the carrier and 2,000 sailors. That was the brutal math of war. Why did they take off so early? One Japanese patrol boat changed everything. The original plan was to launch the bombers about 400 miles from Japan. But on April 18, 1942, while the task force was still 650 to 750 miles out, they were spotted by a small Japanese picket boat called the Nitomaru. The cruiser Nashville quickly sank her, but the Japanese managed to radio a warning to Tokyo. Doolittle made the call: we launch now. Those extra 250 to 300 miles meant the planes would have barely enough fuel to reach Japan, drop their bombs, and try to make it to China. That's exactly why none of the bombers reached the prepared airfields in China. 15 planes either crashed or their crews bailed out. Only one flew to the Soviet Union. And no, the raid was not purely symbolic. The 16 B-25s dropped nearly 15 tons of bombs, high explosive and incendiary. They hit factories, steel mills, oil storage tanks, and even a military hospital. One bomb struck the light carrier Yuho at Yokosuka and delayed her commissioning by several months. The physical damage wasn't devastating, but for the first time, Japanese civilians saw American bombs falling on their capital. For this mission, the B-25s had no bottom turrets. In the rear windows, the crews installed fake machine guns, simply black-painted wooden sticks, to scare off Japanese fighters from a distance and save weight. And what happened to the crew that landed in the Soviet Union? That was the plane commanded by Captain Edward York, the 8th aircraft to take off. Because of higher than expected fuel consumption, they realized they couldn't reach China, so they headed for the Soviet coast and landed near Vladivostok. The Soviet Union was America's ally against Germany, but it had a neutrality pact with Japan. So the crew was interned. They were actually treated quite well and lived under house arrest for nearly 14 months. Eventually, the Soviets quietly helped them escape through Iran to British authorities, and they made it home. What happened to the survivors? 3 members of the raid were executed by the Japanese after a show trial. Another died from torture and starvation in captivity. The remaining 4 spent nearly 40 months in brutal Japanese prisons. One of them, Lieutenant George Barr, was close to death from exhaustion and disease. But here's what's truly remarkable: after the war, George Barr returned to Japan. As a Christian missionary, he lived there for more than 30 years, preaching and helping the very people who had once tortured him. He fully forgave his captors and rarely spoke about the horrors he endured. He once said, "The Japanese people also suffered terribly from the war." When he passed away in 1993, he was buried with full military honors. The Doolittle Raid forced the Japanese command to make a fateful decision. Before April 1942, Admiral Yamamoto had struggled to convince the Imperial General Staff to attack Midway. But after American bombs fell on Tokyo, everything changed. The Japanese High Command decided they had to push their defensive perimeter much farther out, so that no enemy aircraft could ever again threaten the imperial capital. That decision led them directly to the Battle of Midway. And there, in just a few dramatic minutes, American forces sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, a blow that turned the tide of the Pacific War. So the Doolittle Raid was far more than just a symbolic act of revenge. It was the first domino that set in motion a chain of events leading Japan toward catastrophe. And it all began with 16 Army B-25 bombers lined up on the deck of the USS Hornet. Designing the Hornet is a story that feels more like a detective novel with serious political undertones. In the 1920s and 1930s, American admirals had their hands tied. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 strictly limited the total tonnage of U.S. aircraft carriers to 135,000 tons. At first, they planned to build 5 small carriers of 13,800 tons each, like the Ranger. But the Ranger proved to be a disappointment: poor seakeeping, weak protection, and unsuitable for open ocean combat. So a new concept was born: medium-sized carriers of around 20,000 tons. This gave us the Yorktown-class design. The Hornet became the third and final ship of this class. By 1938, when Japan and Italy abandoned all treaty restrictions, the US finally had freedom to build larger ships. But there was no time to develop a completely new design. War was approaching. The solution was brutally pragmatic: simply copy the proven Yorktown blueprints. Let's look at the numbers. The Hornet was 824 feet 9 inches long, that's roughly 251 meters. Longer than 2 football fields placed end to end. Her flight deck was 114 feet wide, about 35 meters. Standard displacement was 20,000 tons, and full load reached 25,500 tons. But the Hornet wasn't just big, she was fast. 4 Parsons steam turbines, 9 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, and 120,000 horsepower. Designed speed was 32.5 knots. During trials, she reached nearly 34 knots, over 62 kilometers per hour. That speed was vital, to outrun enemies, to launch heavy aircraft into the wind, and to rush to where the battle would be decided. Protection, however, was much more modest. The armored belt ranged from 2.5 to 4 inches and only covered the machinery spaces and magazines. The flight deck and hangar deck had no armor at all. This was the deliberate trade-off for speed and aircraft capacity. One interesting detail, unlike her sister ships Yorktown and Enterprise, the Hornet's island superstructure had only splinter protection, not full armor. When she entered service, her anti-aircraft armament was typical for the early war period: 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 4 quad 1.1-inch Chicago pianos, and 24.50 caliber Browning machine guns. However, modernization began very quickly. Starting in January 1942, the machine guns were replaced by 20mm Oerlikon cannons. By summer, she carried 32 of them. The ship was constantly upgraded between battles, a perfect example of the American Navy's ability to learn and adapt in real time. But the carrier's real weapon was her air group. The Hornet could operate up to 90 to 97 aircraft. She had 3 powerful elevators and catapults that allowed her to launch even heavy Army B-25 bombers during the Doolittle Raid. After Midway, a new radar was installed, but her bridge remained open. There simply wasn't time for a major refit. The Hornet fought almost non-stop, Midway in June, Guadalcanal in August, and her final battle at Santa Cruz in October. The Doolittle Raid made the Hornet a legend. But its toughest and most brutal test was still ahead. June 1942. The Battle of Midway. The Hornet is sailing in formation behind the Enterprise. Thanks to broken Japanese codes, the Americans know the enemy's plan. But on the day of the decisive battle, nothing goes according to script. The torpedo bombers of VT-8 from the Hornet lose contact with their fighter escort. 15 planes head toward the Japanese carriers completely unprotected. They are shot down almost to the last. Out of 30 men, only 1 survives, Ensign George Gay. But their sacrifice was not in vain. While the Japanese Zeros were busy finishing off Hornet's torpedo planes, dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown appeared in the sky. In just 5 minutes, they turned 3 Japanese aircraft carriers into burning wrecks. The Hornet's torpedo bombers had drawn away the enemy fighters at the most critical moment. Without their sacrifice, the outcome of the battle could have been very different. August 1942, the Guadalcanal campaign. The Hornet provides cover for the Marine landings. Her pilots successfully attack Japanese cruisers and transports. Night after night, Japanese bombers harass the ship. The Hornet barely dodges torpedo after torpedo. October 1942, the Battle of Santa Cruz. Japan throws everything into the fight to retake Guadalcanal. 4 Japanese carriers face 2 American ones, the Hornet and the Enterprise. On the morning of October 26, a massive attack hits the Hornet. 3 bombs smash through her deck, and 2 torpedoes rip into her side. The burning carrier loses power. For 3 hours, the crew fights desperately to save the ship, battling fires and trying to restart the engines. But a second wave of Japanese aircraft delivers the final blow. The admiral gives the order, "Abandon ship." The Hornet is left drifting, burning and helpless. That night, Japanese destroyers finish her off with torpedoes. On October 27, 1942, the legendary aircraft carrier slipped beneath the waves. She lived for just 1 year and 6 days. In that short time, she struck Tokyo, fought at Midway, and died heroically at Santa Cruz. Thanks for watching.